The cloister was not entirely quiet, not in the way the word suggests when spoken in reverence. Its stones remembered too much, and I heard them breathe. Rain had swept across Oxford earlier that afternoon, leaving the air sharp and rinsed, the pavement slick, as if varnished. Evening bells rang faintly from a chapel beyond the quadrangle, each note blurred by distance but clear enough to trouble the silence in my head. I was already troubled, and that is perhaps why I chose to walk beneath those arches at all. I should have gone home, poured whiskey, and stared at the crossword until the clues lost their sharpness. Instead, I walked in circles, listening to the drip of rain from stone lips. A porter, grey-haired and perfunctory, nodded to me as if he half knew me. He might have. I have spent so much of my life pacing between libraries and quadrangles that anonymity is only partial. He did not speak, and I did not wish him to. The footsteps of students echoed across the flagstones, light, unburdened, but fading quickly as if guilty of interrupting. Their laughter was subdued, clipped by the air of a place too old to tolerate frivolity. Oxford does that. It presses down like a hand, reminding everyone that centuries have watched, judged, and occasionally punished. I had been called there, of course. There was no chance to wander. Strange how the beginning of things often disguises itself as routine. The phone call had been short. A secretary's voice carefully measured a matter for your attention, Inspector. A man found dead, though not in a way that excused curiosity. Found seated, head bent over a table in one of the college's smaller cloisters, as though absorbed in some unfinished thought. Death often resembles contemplation until one looks closer. I found him easily. 2 constables had cordoned off the arcade with a length of tape that fluttered in the damp air. They looked uncomfortable, as though the medieval walls themselves accused them of trespass. The man at the table was a past accused. He sat in a posture too deliberate to be natural, shoulders bowed, one hand resting palm down, the other curled near his face. A set of papers lay before him, blurred at the edges from water, or perhaps careless handling after. His glasses had slipped slightly down the bridge of his nose, giving the impression of reading even in death. It was almost theatrical, but badly staged. I leaned close, resisting the urge to adjust the glasses. I thought of Hamlet, of a courtier arranging death with props and gestures, but here no stage, no applause, only damp stone and a faint smell of ink. His collar was unbuttoned, the tie was crooked, and I wondered whether that detail mattered. It usually does. Disorder tells a story if one listens long enough. A constable murmured that there were no signs of struggle. The words fell flat. People rarely struggle in the ways expected of them. A hesitation in the air, a missed button, a smear of ink. Those are struggles too, quieter but no less final. I touched the edge of the paper, careful not to disturb it. The ink had bled in one corner where raindrops had kissed it. A half-finished word stared back a single syllable, unanchored, its meaning withheld. That, more than the body, told me the night had only begun. They took him away with the efficiency of habit, leaving me with silence. I prefer silence to efficiency. Efficiency lies in silence. I sat at the same table for a time, trying to feel the echo of his last thought. The cloister amplified sound. Oddly, my breath came back to me in fragments, as though another man exhaled nearby. It is an uncomfortable sensation, being haunted by your own lungs. A student approached then, uncertain, her gown clutched about her. She asked if it were true that someone had died. I said yes, though softly, as if reluctant to release the word. She nodded as though I had confirmed a suspicion rather than revealed news. People always know, even before they know. She lingered, as though hoping I might confess some reassurance. but I had none. When she turned to go, her shoes squeaked faintly on the stone 3 syllables, almost a word. I made a note of the rhythm in my mind. Small things cling. Later, I walked the perimeter of the quadrangle. Lamps had been lit in the windows, pale squares against the dark. Curtains moved faintly, suggesting faces quickly withdrawn. Academics fear scandal more than death. I thought of that word on the paper again. A syllable only. It might have been the start of a name, or the end of a plea. I rolled possibilities in my mind the way one handles crossword entries, some fit for a moment, then collapse under the weight of crossing letters. Still there was a pattern, and I felt the faint tickle of it, though the meaning eluded me. When I finally left the cloister, rain had begun again, soft and persistent. The porter nodded once more as if to confirm that life continued on its proper rails. I envied him at that moment. For him, the day had been little more than wet stone and the closing of a gate. For me, it had become the start of something I could neither articulate nor avoid. I walked toward the street, hands deep in pockets, listening to the bells. Each note seemed to fade before the next began, and, in that interval, lay the emptiness I have always feared, the gap where meaning should reside, but does not. That was the first evening, nothing spectacular, nothing dramatic, only a body, in a cloister, a word half-written, and the rain. Yet I knew, as I always know, that the smallest things resist silence. They demand their story be told, and so I carried it with me, as I always do, like a tune one cannot quite forget, but never fully remembers. I remember the porter's lodge that evening as one remembers the smell of a room, long after leaving it tobacco stale in the curtains. Polish dulled on the desk, the faint smell of wet wool steaming near the radiator. It was not grand, not like the carved oak chambers that tourists imagine when they think of Oxford, but functional, as if efficiency had been grafted onto stone too ancient to accommodate it. The porter himself, the same man who had nodded to me under the cloister, seemed diminished now in the square of lamplight. He sat upright, but weary, his hands folded on a blotter that had known too many nervous fingers. He asked if I would sit, though his tone suggested he would have preferred I did not. I sat anyway. He did not waste time. "There is always a letter," he said, his eyes sliding away to the pigeonholes stacked behind him. He rose, shuffling slightly as though the effort of walking bore more weight than the act itself should. From the topmost slot he withdrew a plain envelope, its corner bent where careless fingers had pressed it in. He laid it before me with a curious reluctance, as if by handing it over he surrendered some quiet control. It was addressed to no one. No name, no title, no mark of destination. Only the college crest printed faintly in the corner, and a smudge where damp had kissed it. I held it a moment, not opening, listening instead to the clock that ticked above the porter's head. The sound was steady, unimpressed by our unease. When I slit the envelope, the paper inside came free reluctantly, clinging as though it too knew it should not be disturbed. The handwriting was small, angular, and unmistakably deliberate, a few lines only, written in ink that had blotted once at the edge of a word, as though the hand had trembled or the pen had hesitated. The message was no message at all, only fragments, but fragments can be more dangerous than declarations. The silence is heavier than the truth, but one of them must break. I folded it again, slowly, as though hoping repetition might conjure clarity. The porter asked if it meant anything. I said it did not, though that was untrue. Silence heavier than truth was a weight I understood too well. I asked who had placed it in the box. He shook his head, eyes narrowing. It had arrived that afternoon, he said, slipped in unnoticed between deliveries. Perhaps by a student, perhaps by none. Things appear and vanish in colleges without reason, he muttered, as if this absolved him. I did not argue. He was right. The old buildings are sieves through which both secrets and dust escape. I asked if the dead man, Professor Aldis, the porter named him, had collected his mail that day. Another shake of the head. He had not come by since the morning before, and even then only briefly requesting his usual journal. The porter remembered because Aldis had been distracted, failing to return a greeting. He had carried with him a satchel too heavy for its appearance. Such details matter. A satchel heavier than it should be tells its own story, though not one immediately understood. I pocketed the letter, knowing it would be resented. Evidence always feels like theft to those who live among it. The porter leaned back, arms folded, now as if barricading himself from further questions. His eyes slid to the ledger open on his desk, names and times recorded in cramped hands. He turned it slightly toward me, though not enough to be considered generous. I glanced down. One name had been crossed through with a line so firm that the paper beneath was nearly torn. The time beside it, 5:27, remained visible. I pointed. He shrugged. "A mistake," he said. "No one of that name resides here." Still, the entry had existed long enough to require erasure. Mistakes often tell more than accuracy. Outside, the rain thickened, beating against the window with a persistence that suggested it wished entry. I thought of Aldis again, his head bent as though over words unfinished. The half-written syllable on the paper before him, and this letter, anonymous and accusatory, seemed like halves of a cipher that refused to meet. Silence and truth. One must break. But which? In the crossword I had left unfinished at home, one clue had demanded a 6-letter word for confession. I had filled in nothing yet, though the answer now tugged faintly at me. Perhaps the puzzle was less about letters than timing. Confessions do not arrive when summoned. They arrive when they cannot be withheld. The porter coughed softly, reminding me of his presence. He asked if the professor had been murdered. His voice was steady, but his eyes were not. I told him we did not know. It was the truth, though not the comfort he sought. He nodded once, as if confirmation of uncertainty was still better than silence. I wondered then how many times he had asked similar questions over years and decades, as scholars came and went, as scandals brushed the edges of his world without fully breaking it. A porter is both custodian and confessor, though neither role is rewarded. When I left the lodge, the quadrangle was deserted, rain forming small mirrors on the flagstones. The lamps glowed faintly, halos trembling in the wet. I walked slowly, the letter heavy in my pocket. Silence heavier than truth. I repeated the phrase under my breath, as one tests the weight of a coin. It rang differently each time. Perhaps it was not a warning, but a justification. Or perhaps it was neither merely a thought too fragile to endure without witness. Still, I could not dismiss it. The dead man had carried silence to his last breath. Whether it was his own or someone else's, I could not yet tell. At the far archway I paused, looking back at the porter's lodge, the square of light now muted by distance. I felt watched, though no figure stood there. The sensation clung to me, sharper than the rain. Someone else had walked these stones, slipped that letter into its slot, and vanished into the same night that now wrapped itself around me. They would return, I thought. Silence always circles back to itself until it is forced to break. I lit a cigarette then, though the rain soon defeated it. Still the gesture mattered. Smoke had always helped me think, and even in failure it provided a ritual. The ember died quickly, leaving only the taste of ash. I dropped it onto the stone, where it hissed faintly. The sound reminded me of a whisper cut short, a confession abandoned. I turned my collar up and walked toward the street, the phrase echoing with each step. The silence is heavier than the truth, and already, I feared, it had begun to press down upon me. The morning after the cloister, the air carried that faint scent of chalk and rain that clings to Oxford whenever the bells are still heavy from the night. I walked across the quad as though I belonged there, though I never truly have. A detective is tolerated, not welcomed in these old sanctuaries. One is reminded of it in the glances, half curious, half reproachful, trail behind your steps. The dons protect their own, even in death, and I was merely an interloper, invited only because death had refused to remain discreet. Professor Aldis had held a set of rooms in the North Range, a corner staircase worn smooth by centuries of shoes. When I reached the door, it was locked, though the key hung on a hook in the porter's lodge. The porter himself produced it with reluctance, as if each clink of the brass against the ring betrayed an oath. He muttered that the rooms were seldom used of late. Aldis preferred his house beyond the Banbury Road, he said. He kept these chambers only for appearances, a relic of habit. A scholar's absence is often remarked upon only when it grows inconvenient. Inside, the rooms were colder than the stone outside. Curtains drawn, dust holding dominion on the mantelpiece, books lined with military precision yet lacking the disorder of real affection. I lit the lamp. Its weak glow revealed little more than the shape of emptiness. A teacup sat on the desk, its rim furred with neglect. Beside it, an ink bottle, but no pen. I traced the faint ring the cup had left on the blotter, as though the absent scholar might return to complete the circle. On the shelves, volumes of theology rubbed shoulders with a few pieces of music, their spines cracked from long reading. Bach, Handel, Tallis. Men who had known how silence could be structured into harmony. I thought of the letter again, the silence heavier than the truth, and wondered if Aldis had copied the phrase from one of these. The absence of a pen nagged at me. A man who writes must always have one close. If it was gone, it had been taken, either by him or by another. A notebook lay open near the window, its first pages filled with neat Latin quotations, the later ones devolving into scattered jottings. Half-phrases, abrupt figures, and one word, circled twice viator. Traveller. I sat with it for a long time, mouthing the syllables. A man who had ceased to live in his rooms writes viator as if expecting departure. Was it a confession or an anticipation? I could not tell. Yet I felt again that tug of a crossword clue solved in the periphery of thought. A traveller is never entirely absent. He is merely elsewhere. From the staircase below came a shuffle, hesitant but insistent. I found a young fellow waiting, gown dishevelled, eyes too bright for comfort. He asked if it were true that Aldis had been found dead. I said yes. He stared at the door as though expecting it to answer for itself. He told me he was Aldis's research assistant, though his name, Howard, meant nothing to me then. He insisted the professor had seemed distracted for weeks, speaking less, walking the quad at odd hours. Once he had found him in the library at dawn, copying something by candlelight. But when pressed on what, Howard's eyes faltered. "Only music," he said finally. "Always music." I asked when he had last seen Aldis. 3 nights before, after supper. The professor had dismissed him early, muttering about correspondence that could not wait. Howard's voice trailed off. He added, almost as an afterthought, that Aldis had been expecting a visitor, though no one had arrived by the time he left. The boy's hands twitched as he spoke. I thought then of the ledger in the porter's lodge, the name crossed through so violently. Mistakes are never only mistakes. I dismissed Howard gently. He lingered a moment, as though reluctant to leave me alone with the dust, then vanished down the staircase. I returned to the desk. The absence of the pen grew larger in my mind, louder than the presence of books and notes. A scholar missing his pen is like a musician without an instrument. Silence might be chosen, but it is never natural. I tried the drawers. Empty, save for a railway timetable folded neatly in the bottom. I opened it. One line had been underlined in pencil: the evening service to Paddington. No date marked, no explanation. Absence again, but pointed this time, directed. I closed the rooms carefully, locking the door as if sealing a tomb. The porter took the key back without comment, sliding it onto the hook where it seemed already forgotten. Yet as I turned to leave, he asked whether I thought the professor had suffered. I said quietly that I did not know. He nodded once, more in resignation than in hope. We all fear absence, I thought. It is the one truth we cannot reconcile. Later, in the college library, I found myself staring at the catalogue. Names entered, crossed out, replaced, the ledger of presence and absence repeating itself. My eye caught on a misfiled card, the professor's name entered under music rather than theology. A small error, or perhaps not. Absences are sometimes concealed by the wrong presences. I slipped the card back into place, though the gesture felt dishonest. There was more here than dust and silence. The dead man's absence had weight, and like the letter, it pressed against me until I could scarcely breathe. Walking back across the quad, rain began again, light but insistent. I thought of Aldous, of the circled word in his notebook, of the vanished pen, viator, traveller, one who leaves, and I wondered then if absence itself might be a kind of departure, chosen or otherwise. In Oxford, absence is often overlooked, but I had learned long ago that it is the missing word in the crossword that anchors all the rest. Until it is filled, nothing else fits. The river is always different at dawn, though the city beyond it never changes. That morning it lay still, a sheet of pewter beneath a bruised sky, broken only by the occasional ripple of a bird landing where it should not. I stood on the bank with my collar turned up, the damp air settling into my bones. A constable had telephoned at some unkind hour, his voice awkwardly careful. Something had been found near the college boathouse, he said. He did not know if it mattered. It always matters, I thought, though rarely in the way one expects. The path down to the water was narrow, half lost under wet leaves, and I walked it as one would a memory, hesitant, uneasy, aware that each step disturbed what had settled. The constable was waiting with another man, the boatman who kept watch over oars and shells with the patience of one who had outlived 1,000 crews. His face was unreadable, though his hands fidgeted with a length of rope. He had been the one to find it, they told me. He nodded toward the reeds without ceremony. I looked, expecting little, and saw too much. It was only a satchel at first glance, black leather swollen from water. Yet the way it lay half submerged, strap-tangled in the reeds, suggested it had not been dropped in haste. It had been placed. The constable leaned down, awkward in his boots, and lifted it free. Water spilled from the seams, dark as ink. He looked at me, waiting for permission. I gestured. He opened it slowly as though fearing it might breathe. Inside were papers, blurred but still legible in parts, their corners curling like old leaves. Music scores, I realized, though not the sort copied by students for exams. These were precise, neat, almost reverent in execution. Bach again, Tallis again, silence structured into notes. Among them lay the missing pen. It was silver, engraved with initials barely visible in the misted light. H. A. Howard Aldis, No scholar abandons his instrument willingly, not one who circles words like Vieta in his notebook. The presence of it here, adrift in the river, told me more than the absence in his rooms had. Someone had wished to erase him, not by hiding, but by scattering. I lifted one of the scores carefully. The ink had run in places, blurring rests into notes, silences into sound. Yet, in the margin of one page, a line remained clear, unspoiled by the water. Not Aldis's hand, a smaller script, hurried, less elegant. It did not read this time. I folded the page back, and for a moment the world seemed quieter, as though the river itself had paused to listen. Not this time, a denial perhaps, or a promise deferred. Either way, it was a phrase too deliberate to ignore. The constable asked if it was suicide. His words floated clumsily, unfit for the damp air. I said nothing. The river answers no such questions. Men drown here often enough by accident or despair, but satchels with music and engraved pens do not arrange themselves in reeds. The boatman muttered something about shadows on the towpath the night before, shapes moving where none should have. He had not looked closely. He never did. Oxford teaches its servants to see only what they are told to. I thanked him, though the words felt hollow. We carried the satchel up the path, its weight growing heavier with each step, though the water drained freely from it. Absence has a way of pressing down more than presence, and Aldis's absence was now tangible in my hands. At the top of the bank I paused, staring across the river. Rowers would come soon, their laughter cutting the mist, their blades shattering the surface into ripples that erased themselves within seconds. They would not notice that silence had already been broken here. Back in my office, the papers spread themselves across the desk like drowned birds. I dried them carefully, blotting ink, aligning edges, though no order could restore what had been lost. Still patterns emerged, a sequence of notes repeated across several sheets, not a melody but a code. Bach had done as much, weaving numbers into sound. Aldis had copied him, perhaps for study, perhaps for something else. My eye caught on the sequence 1439. I thought of the crossword. Waiting at home, clues unsolved. The numbers suggested letters, and letters suggested words. I tried them in my head, but nothing fit, not yet. Clues never yield themselves when commanded. In the corner of one page, faint but unmistakable, was the outline of a crest, the college's, pressed into the paper by a seal or stamp. It suggested these pages had once belonged not to Aldis alone, but to the institution itself. A theft, then, or a return. Either way, the river had been chosen as custodian. The thought disturbed me. Water remembers nothing. It erases, it blurs, it carries away. Why give silence to something that cannot keep it? Evening fell before I looked up again. The satchel sat empty now, its shape collapsed, its use concluded. I lit a cigarette and let the smoke curl toward the ceiling. Outside, the rain had begun again, soft but steady, tapping against the window like a clock that refused to stop. I thought of Aldis, of his bowed head in the cloister, of the word he had left half-written. Perhaps this satchel had been his confession, scattered before he could speak, or perhaps it had been planted after, a gesture by another hand. The phrase in the margin this time would not leave me. Denial, promise, threat. Each was possible. None was certain. In Oxford, certainty is rare. The river keeps its secrets as well as the libraries do, though with less reverence. I closed the window against the rain, folded the papers once more, and poured myself whiskey. The silence pressed in around me, heavier than truth, heavier even than absence. And somewhere beyond it, I knew, someone was waiting for it to break. There are rooms in Oxford where the air itself is complicated. The common rooms, heavy with pipe smoke and sherry, are among them. I entered one late in the afternoon when the light from the tall windows had dulled into that tired glow which makes every portrait look accusatory. The dons had gathered already, murmuring in low tones that died at my approach. I was not expecting, though perhaps they had suspected I would come. In matters of scandal, the presence of a policeman is inevitable, like damp on old stone. The master, polite but unwilling, waved me toward a chair near the fire. I did not sit. Fires in these places warm only the portraits. The men arranged around the room were of a type one learns to recognize cultivated, guarded, and weary of intrusion. Each held his glass as if it were a shield. They asked no questions, though I felt them waiting. When I asked instead, the silence pressed in like another wall. They had all known Aldous, of course. Some admired him, some merely tolerated. One said he had grown eccentric of late, his lectures scattered, his walks prolonged. Another observed that he had missed a series of meetings, excused without explanation. I watched their eyes as they spoke. Few lingered on me most and sought refuge in the fire or in their glasses. Only one thin man with ink on his cuffs looked directly, as though daring me to contradict. His name was Fenton. He admitted without hesitation that Aldous had quarrelled with him over the ownership of certain manuscripts. He smiled when he said it, but it was the sort of smile that guards more than it reveals. The conversation turned awkwardly to music. It always does in Oxford when other matters are unsafe. Aldous had been known for his obsession with scores, copying them meticulously, humming under his breath in corridors. They spoke of it with faint amusement, as one might of a colleague's harmless eccentricity. Yet I thought of the satchel by the river, the blurred pages, the penciled phrase not this time. Harmlessness seemed an inadequate word. One don, grey and expansive, mentioned that Aldous had received letters in recent weeks, always collected from the porter with a haste unbecoming to him. He had once seen the handwriting sharp, angled, foreign perhaps. The description reminded me of the letter in the lodge, the silence heavier than the truth. Fragments again. Words without context. The dons did not pursue it. They never pursue what might tarnish their stone. I asked quietly whether Aldous had enemies. The master answered before the others could. Academics, he said, do not have enemies. They have disagreements. His tone was firm, but the pause that followed it suggested otherwise. Silence is always louder after denial. I pressed no further. Truth in such rooms comes not from questions, but from the way hands tighten on glasses or from the hesitation before a word. Afterwards I stepped into the corridor. The air there was no less heavy, but at least it was honest. A notice board sagged under layers of paper concerts, lectures, debates. One flyer in particular caught my eye. A recital of Tallis scheduled for the night. Aldous had last been seen alive. The corner of the flyer was torn away, but not cleanly. I touched the ragged edge. Someone had removed a name or a note, deliberately, impatiently. It was a small clue, almost nothing, but I have learned that absence, again absence, often anchors the pattern. Howard, the assistant, appeared in the corridor then, moving too quickly for nonchalance. He asked if the dons had spoken freely. I said they had spoken. He looked down, biting at his lip. He confessed that Aldous had asked him to fetch books that week from the Bodleian, but not in theology scores again, manuscripts on loan from abroad. Howard had questioned it, but the professor had silenced him with a gesture. A scholar's silence, heavier than explanation. I thought then of the penciled numbers in the margins of the blurred scores 14, 3, 9, letters perhaps, a code perhaps, or perhaps merely noise, yet codes rarely emerge without intent. We walked together a short way. He told me Aldous had grown fearful in his last days, looking over his shoulder, speaking of shadows in the quadrangle. He believed he was being followed. Howard said this with the nervous conviction of youth, but his hands betrayed uncertainty. Fear does not always belong to the one described. Sometimes it belongs to the speaker. I let him go, though the unease lingered after his footsteps had faded. Later, alone in my office, I returned to the crossword. A clue I had struggled with the night before now seemed to yield itself. Enemy concealed in truth, 6 letters. The answer emerged quietly. I underlined it. Concealed in truth. It was nothing, perhaps, but the echo of the Don's denial that academics have disagreements, not enemies, fitted too neatly. Truth conceals as much as it reveals. Aldous had written that silence is heavier than the truth. Perhaps he had known this too well. The evening closed around me like a damp coat. The common room's smoke still clung to my clothes, and I smelled again the stale sherry, the fire that warmed no one. I thought of the Dons, their guarded faces, their measured words. Suspects? Yes, but in Oxford everyone is suspect, and no one is guilty until the stone itself confesses. I poured whiskey, not for clarity but for company, and let the silence settle once more. It was heavier than truth, heavier even than the absence that had begun to gnaw at the edges of the case. It was in the solicitor's office, just beyond St. Aldate's, where the matter of the will was first laid before me. A narrow room, lined with shelves that sagged under years of parchments and folders, smelled of leather and dust, of decisions bound in ribbon. The man behind the desk was precise in his movements, each gesture clipped as if rehearsed. He spoke of Professor Aldis's affairs with the detachment of one who has seen too many men reduced to paper. There was nothing remarkable, he insisted, save that the will had been revised only a fortnight before the professor's death. Such timing is never unremarkable, I thought, though he seemed unwilling to draw the connection. The document itself was plain, its clauses brief, its signatures firm. Yet one line caught my eye, a request not to family or college, but to a trust unfamiliar even to the solicitor, the Oxford consort of ancient music. He admitted he had never heard of it, though the name rang faintly to me, like a half-remembered hymn. The sum, modest but deliberate, was enough to draw attention. It suggested a purpose. A scholar leaves behind his books, his money, his silence, but to leave it to music there was a meaning, though one still blurred. I left the office with a copy folded into my coat. The rain had begun again, more drizzle than storm, yet it clung to the paper as if eager to smudge ink into ambiguity. I walked toward the High, past students hurrying with their collars up, past cyclists splashing through puddles with studied indifference. Oxford in rain is a place of ghosts. Every stone seems darker, every arch heavier. I thought of Aldous, his head bent in the cloister, his satchel washed up by the river, and now this will, adjusted in silence, a pattern forming, but a pattern of shadows. Back in my rooms I spread the document beside the damp scores salvaged from the river. One phrase echoed the other. In the will, the bequest. In the margins of the score, not this time. Both deliberate, both pointed away from the expected. I poured whiskey and stared, letting the silence deepen until it became almost companionable. A crossword clue from the previous evening floated back to me. False lead, 3 words. The answer had eluded me then, but now it surfaced as an easily read herring. The will, perhaps, was exactly that, too visible, too neat. Something meant to draw attention while something else slipped unseen. I returned to the college that evening, the document folded back into my coat. The porter, as ever, acknowledged me with a nod that was neither welcome nor refusal. In the common room, the dons spoke in low tones, their faces drawn. I asked, almost idly, if any of them had known of the consort of ancient music. A pause, brief but telling. Fenton, the thin one with ink on his cuffs, smiled again, that tight smile that concealed more than it yielded. He said he had sung with them once, years ago when voices were stronger and ambitions less guarded. He dismissed it as nothing more than a group of amateurs, a name to lend dignity to occasional gatherings. Yet the flicker in his eyes when I mentioned the bequest told me it was not so casual. Afterwards, in the corridor, Howard sought me again. He had overheard talk of the will. He seemed unsettled, almost guilty. He admitted that Aldous had mentioned making provision for something, though whether music or manuscript, he could not recall. His memory faltered, his words tangled. I watched his hands again, restless as before, betraying unease he tried to bury under earnestness. He asked if the bequest mattered. I told him it might, though perhaps not in the way anyone expected. The truth is always half elsewhere. I lingered in the library after he had gone. The great hall was empty, save for the faint creak of floorboards as the building settled into night. I walked the rows, touching spines lightly, as if each might yield confession. Near the back I found a volume of consorts and early music, dust thick on its cover. Inside, a slip of paper no larger than a hand had been pressed between pages. It bore a single word in that same angular hand as the letter from the porter's lodge, Requiem. I held it under the lamplight, its ink faded but firm. Silence again, clothed in music, heavier than explanation. The thought struck me then that the will was not intended for the solicitor nor for the college. It was intended as a message, as clear to its recipient as it was opaque to us. A red herring for some, a summons for others. The phrase from the crossword whispered through me again. Red herring. Perhaps that was its only function, to delay, to mislead, to keep us from seeing the note in the library, the satchel by the river, the numbers in the margins. To make us look left when the truth lay to the right. I left the library near midnight, the rain still falling, bells marking the hour in tones that seemed heavier than usual. On the steps I paused, looking back at the darkened windows. Absence again, pressing close, demanding recognition. The will was not absence, but distraction. And distraction is more dangerous than silence, for it persuades us to believe we are moving toward clarity, when in fact we circle endlessly around it. I walked home slowly, the paper in my pocket like a weight I had not chosen, and wondered whether Aldous had known we would follow his false trail, or whether someone else had written it for him. The chapel had always unsettled me, even in daylight. By evening it grew worse, when shadows stretched along the carved stalls and the air carried the faint smell of wax and damp stone. I arrived just as the choir were gathering, their gowns swaying like dark water in the half-light. Boys' voices, high and unbroken, mingled with the deeper hum of older men warming themselves with scales. I stood near the back, partly hidden, partly intruding. No one questioned my presence. The police, even in Oxford, are granted a peculiar kind of invisibility everyone notices, no one acknowledges. The choir master, a brisk man with silver hair, tapped his baton against the lectern. The sound echoed like a gavel in that hollowed space. They began with Tallis. The lines interlaced, weaving silence into sound, and for a moment I forgot the investigation, forgot Aldous bent over his unfinished word. Then it returned more sharply than before, for the music he had copied in his notebooks, those same cadences, those same voices, was now alive before me. Absence made present. I listened as one might to a ghost speaking in its own language. As they sang, I watched their faces. Most were turned toward their scores, eyes dutiful, mouths precise. But one stood out, Fenton, the Don with ink on his cuffs, hidden among the basses. His lips moved, but not always in time with the others. His eyes flicked, not toward the conductor, but toward the shadows at the edge of the chapel. Once, he pressed his hand against his pocket as if checking the presence of something fragile. A gesture small enough to ignore, but I have learned that the smallest gestures often matter most. During the interval, the singers broke into murmurs, their voices no longer united but scattered into ordinary speech. I slipped outside into the cloister that adjoined the chapel. Rain had begun again, dripping from the gutters, making the stone gleam darkly. The choirmaster followed a few moments later, wiping his spectacles. He nodded at me, then asked, with a kind of weariness, whether Aldis's death was believed to involve the choir. His tone was curious but not innocent. I told him nothing. He sighed, muttering that Aldis had been too devoted to the music, treating it as if it contained a secret others were too blind to see. Secrets in music, he said, are dangerous. I thought of the coded sequences in the blurred scores, numbers disguised as notes, words concealed in rests. He was right. When the second part of practice began, I returned to the back of the chapel. This time they sang a requiem. The word pressed heavily, echoing the slip of paper I had found in the library. I closed my eyes. The voices rose, then fell, leaving silence in their wake like breath withheld. And in that silence I heard again Aldis's phrase, "The silence is heavier than the truth." It rang differently now, as though the music had given it context. A silence after sound is not absence, it is presence by other means. Perhaps Aldis had known this, perhaps it had been his message all along. Afterwards, when the singers dispersed into the rain-soaked quadrangle, I lingered in the chapel. The air was warmer now, though heavy with breath and candle wax. Fenton approached, his step hesitant, his eyes fixed on me with that same challenging look. He remarked casually that Aldis had often sat in the shadows during these rehearsals, making notes, humming quietly to himself. It had unnerved the others, he said, to be observed so intently. I asked why Aldis had cared so much for the music. Fenton shrugged, but too quickly. Then, as if unable to resist, he added that Aldis believed music could preserve what words could not. A curious statement, and one that fitted too neatly with everything else. I watched him leave, his coat collar turned against the rain, his stride quick, almost relieved. He had told me something, though perhaps not what he intended. Music preserves what words cannot. Perhaps the will, the bequest to the consort, was less about money and more about survival. A message hidden in plain sound, a code written not in letters but in notes. The scores in the satchel were not random copies, they were confessions or accusations disguised as music. Later that night at my desk, I opened the crossword once more. One clue had resisted me for days. The song conceals truth, 5 letters. I tried again. The answer came quietly, as if whispered by the requiem itself, psalm. A song, yes, but also a prayer, a confession, a silence given voice. I underlined it, though my hand trembled slightly. The puzzle of Aldis's death was not solved, not even close, but the edges had begun to align. Silence, truth, music, absence. Each word is like a note, forming a phrase not yet spoken. The rain persisted against the window, insistent, steady, as though rehearsing its own endless practice. I poured whiskey and listened, letting the silence between drops weigh more than the sound itself. Somewhere in Oxford, someone else was listening too, waiting for the music to end. The morning came grey and indifferent, as if Oxford itself had no interest in what had passed or what might yet unfold. I sat at my desk with the crossword open before me, the newspaper spread wide and curling at the edges where damp had found it. The puzzle has always been my confession box, the place where order masquerades as chance, and where every answer, if properly considered, must eventually emerge. That morning, however, it offered me only contradictions. Clues bent back upon themselves, words that almost fit but refused to settle. It felt less like solving than like being taunted. One clue in particular held me. Silence conceals its opposite, 8 letters. I tried truth, absence, concealment. None fitted the crossings. The letters mocked me, presenting alternatives that collapsed at the next turn. I thought of Aldous, of his unfinished word in the cloister, of the angular hand that had scrawled, not this time, in the margins of music. Contradictions everywhere, as if silence itself had learned how to speak in half-truths. I circled the clue in pencil and set the page aside, though it lay heavy beside the whiskey glass I had not yet washed from the night before. I walked into the college later, the air sharp, the cobblestones wet enough to reflect the lamplight long after morning had technically arrived. In the porter's lodge, the man looked at me without expression, though his hand lingered near the ledger, as if afraid I might ask to see it again. I did not. Some questions, asked too often, ceased to yield answers. Instead, I asked about the post that had arrived. He shrugged. "None for Aldous now," he said, his voice carrying the faint edge of reproach. "The dead require no letters, Inspector." His words lingered. I thought again of the anonymous envelope, the silence heavier than the truth. Letters continue their journeys even when their recipients cannot. In the library I sought quiet, though Oxford libraries rarely grant it. Each creak of the boards, each whispered turning of a page, is louder than it should be. I seated myself near the back, where Aldous had once copied by candlelight. There, spread across the desk, I placed the crossword once more. Contradictions, I told myself, are not failures of thought, they are indicators of truth disguised. A contradiction forces one to consider what has been assumed. For Aldous, silence had concealed music for me, words concealed absence. Perhaps the clue's answer was a paradox. 8 letters, fitting neatly. I wrote it in, the pencil scratching softly, and felt the faint satisfaction of a small truth confirmed. Yet even as I wrote, I knew it was too easy. Crosswords deceive with elegance. Life deceives with malice. Howard found me there, his eyes restless, his steps hesitant. He said he had discovered something among Aldous's things, though he was uncertain whether it mattered. A slip of paper tucked into a score, bearing a series of numbers. He handed it over with reluctance, as though passing contraband. 3, 14, 19, 25. At first they seemed meaningless, but in the crossword grid before me, my eyes caught on the numbered clues. 3 across, 14 down, 19 across, 25 down. Each blank had now been filled thanks to my earlier efforts. Their answers note, choir, shadow, end. When arranged in sequence, they formed not a sentence, but a gesture toward one. Note, choir, shadow, end. I repeated it aloud under my breath. Not this time. The contradiction tightened. Howard shifted, uneasy under my silence. He asked if it was a code, if Aldous had left us a message. I told him, perhaps. He pressed further. Was it dangerous? I did not answer. Danger in Oxford is never dramatic. It creeps, it whispers, it conceals itself under gowns and manuscripts. Howard left me then, his footsteps fading across the creaking boards. I stared at the numbers again, their stubborn precision. Aldous had not chosen them idly. He had linked his silence to a crossword, a puzzle meant to outlive him. Contradiction, I thought, silence concealing its opposite. Perhaps the opposite of silence is not sound, but exposure. Later I returned to the common room. The dons were gathered again, this time subdued, their glasses heavier in their hands. I mentioned the bequest once more, the consort of ancient music. A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Fenton, as before, smiled with his ink-stained cuffs, but the smile was thinner now, strained. He asked why I was so interested in music when the man had died in a cloister, not in a choir stall. His tone was light, but his eyes betrayed urgency. I told him that contradictions often reveal the truth. He laughed softly, but it was the sort of laugh that dies quickly, leaving only silence. When I left them, the corridor outside smelled faintly of damp wool and old polish. On the notice board, the recital flyer remained, its torn corner still accusing. I touched it again, tracing the edge. It matched too neatly with the words Howard had brought me. Note, choir, shadow, end. A recital of Tallis, a choir practice where shadows lingered, an end not yet explained. Contradiction against a scholar who copied music, but died in silence a will, leaving music, but meant to distract a satchel planted by the river but containing only fragments. Every clue a contradiction, every answer provisional. That night, back in my room, I returned once more to the crossword. Another clue awaits false trail concealing true path. 11 letters. I hesitated, then wrote in misdirection. It fits. But as I underlined it, I wondered whether I had solved the clue or whether the clue had solved me. Contradictions were multiplying, not resolving. And in their multiplication lay the faint outline of something darker, something Aldis had perhaps understood too well. The silence pressing heavier now, more insistent, until even the scratching of my pencil seemed intrusive. I poured whiskey, sat back, and let the night gather. Contradictions, I thought, are not errors, they are signposts. And somewhere in Oxford someone had left me a map written entirely in contradictions. The Bodleian archives smell of time itself, paper, leather, dust, and the faint tang of iron locks. I walked their corridors late in the afternoon, the kind of hour when daylight leaks reluctantly through high windows and every footstep seems both permitted and profane. A librarian, thin and dry as the parchment he guarded, led me without speech to a table already prepared. There, laid out with careful hands, was the box that bore Aldis's name. The professor had deposited certain papers, he said, though none of particular value. His tone implied skepticism at my interest. He left me then, the shuffle of his shoes receding into silence that was not quite silence at all, for the wood creaked as though reluctant to accept my intrusion. I opened the box with the solemnity one reserves for coffins. Most of it was predictable lecture notes, syllabi, marginalia in Latin. But among the brittle leaves was a small packet tied in red string. Inside, photographs, black and white, their edges curling, their surfaces glossy with age. Some depicted choirs, faces blurred into anonymity by the poor light of chapels. Others showed quadrangles, empty, save for shadows that stretched too long to be mere absence, and one, near the bottom, caught me with the force of recognition. A choir, mid-rehearsal, and at the edge, half-shadowed, sat Aldis himself, his head bent not in prayer, but in concentration. Before him lay a notebook, and beside him, though blurred, unmistakable, the figure of Fenton, his gaze turned directly toward the lens. A smile ghosted on his lips, not friendly, not innocent, as if he had known the photograph would survive longer than the moment. I held it closer to the lamp. In the background, just visible above the choir stalls, a torn flyer clung to the notice board, its corner ragged, just as I had seen in the corridor days before. The same recital, the same absence of a name. Absence again, written into the picture like a watermark. I traced the edge of the paper in the photograph, though it yielded no more than memory. Still, the confirmation mattered. What I had touched on the board now had its echo in the past, a pattern, faint but persistent, like a phrase repeated in music until it imprints itself on the ear. I asked the librarian when the photograph had been deposited. He pursed his lips, consulted a ledger with exaggerated care. "Years ago," he said, "possibly by Aldous himself, possibly by no one. Items appear in the archives as they appear in life, unannounced, unattributed, accepted without question." His words reminded me of the porter speaking of letters that slipped unnoticed into boxes. Oxford, it seemed, encouraged the untraceable. I left the archive with the photograph folded carefully into my coat. Outside, the evening was settling. The rain fine but unrelenting, stitching the air into a grey veil. I walked toward the college, the photograph pressing against my side like an unspoken confession. In the quadrangle, students hurried past, their voices raised in laughter that dissolved into echoes. None of them noticed me, or perhaps they did, but in Oxford, noticing is often indistinguishable from ignoring. In the common room, the dons had gathered once more, smoke and sherry heavy in the air. I placed the photograph on the table without a preamble. Silence followed, thicker than the smoke. Fenton's hand twitched toward his glass. He remarked casually that old photographs capture little of value. I replied that they captured more than intended. He said nothing further, but his eyes lingered too long on the torn flyer in the background. The others avoided looking at him, which told me more than words could. Guilt in Oxford is rarely confessed. It is distributed, shared by silence, divided among glances. Later, alone in my office, I studied the photograph again. Aldous's notebook lay open in the image, though the contents blurred. Still, the angle of his pen, the curve of his hand, suggested writing rather than copying. Perhaps he had been recording not music, but thought. Perhaps the music was only the medium for something heavier. My gaze shifted once more to Fenton. His expression haunted me. Not joy, not malice, but a kind of anticipation, as though he were waiting for a contradiction to resolve itself in his favour. I turned to the crossword, half completed, beside my glass. A clue stared back at me. Image preserves absence, 12 letters. I counted the spaces, then the letters of a word that had been lingering in my mind since the archive. Photograph. I wrote it in. It fitted too well. Absence preserved, silence given a face. A photograph is proof, but proof without explanation. It tells only that something once was, not what it meant. The answer satisfied the puzzle, but left the mystery intact. As all photographs do, the rain deepened against the window, steady, insistent. I poured whiskey and held the photograph to the lamplight once more. Aldous bent over his notebook, Fenton watching the lens. The choir singing in silence, the torn flyer, name missing. Every element a piece, yet none yielding its whole. Contradictions again, preserved in glossy paper. I placed it carefully back in the box on my desk, closed the lid, and let the silence resume its dominion. It was heavier now, pressing not only on the case, but on me. For in Oxford, every discovery is less a solution than another clue, and every clue another photograph, a preservation of absence and nothing more. There is a peculiar relief in believing one has reached an answer, even when one suspects it to be wrong. That evening I carried such relief with me, as if it were a borrowed coat ill-fitting but briefly warm. I had arranged the pieces in my mind, the satchel by the river, the letter in the porter's lodge, the altered will, the photograph in the archive. They formed a story, not flawless, but coherent enough to quiet the restless echo of questions. I told myself that coherence was what mattered, though even then I knew it was only a salve. Truth, in Oxford, never presents itself as coherence. It arrives as a contradiction, cloaked in silence. The dons gathered once more in the common room, their glasses full, their voices muted. I watched them, the way one watches actors rehearsing lines they do not yet believe. My eyes rested on Fenton. It was too easy, far too easy, to make him the centre. His ink-stained cuffs, his uneasy smile, his presence in the photograph beside Aldate detail fitted too neatly into the puzzle I had begun to assemble. He had quarrelled with Aldis, had motive in manuscripts and pride, and had the look of a man who resented but admired. Yes, it was tempting. Too tempting. And so I let myself indulge the temptation, though already I felt the floorboards shifting beneath me. I spoke little, only enough to stir the surface. Fenton replied smoothly, his words rehearsed, but his hands betrayed him. They twitched once as I mentioned the will, the consort of ancient music, the bequest that had seemed at first a distraction. He claimed ignorance, claimed irrelevance. The others avoided his gaze. I told myself this was guilt. It might have been, but guilt in Oxford is a common inheritance, shared by all who survive its corridors. I mistook their silence for agreement. Silence is heavier than the truth. Aldis's phrase again, echoing against the sherry glasses. Howard found me afterwards in the corridor, his face pale, his eyes urgent. He whispered that he had seen Fenton near the river the night the satchel had been planted. I pressed him. Was he certain? He faltered, then nodded too quickly. He'd see. Eagerness to please betrayed him, yet I chose not to see it. A solution had offered itself. False or not, I wanted it. I left the college that night believing I had found my man, though belief, I should have remembered, is the most treacherous of companions. In my room the crossword lay open as it always did. One clue stared back at me, answer that deceives, 10 letters. The solution leapt too readily to mind, misinformed. I wrote it in, pressing the pencil too hard. It fit, yet unease lingered. A crossword never lies, but it does mislead. It teaches that satisfaction is not proof, that an answer is not always the answer. I closed the paper, poured whiskey, and told myself I had reached an end. I even allowed a moment's pride, though pride has undone better men than me. The following morning, the river betrayed me. Police divers had searched again, more thoroughly, more patiently. They found nothing to tie Fenton to the satchel, nothing to confirm Howard's whispered certainty. Only water, reeds, and silence. Fenton himself remained composed, even amused when questioned. He denied everything with a calm that unsettled me more than denial itself. He spoke of Aldis with faint respect, of music with genuine fondness, of manuscripts with indifference. He seemed almost disappointed that I had accused him, as though the narrative I had built was beneath the dignity of the truth. His smile, thin as ever, carried a trace of pity. I left him with nothing but the hollow weight of my own misjudgment. That night, alone again, I studied the photograph from the archive. I had convinced myself it was proof Fenton's gaze into the lens. Aldis bent over his notebook, the torn flyer in the background. But photographs, I reminded myself, preserve absence, not presence. They freeze gestures without meaning, expressions without context. Fenton's look could be anticipation, amusement, defiance, or nothing at all. My certainty collapsed into ambiguity, and ambiguity, I knew, was closer to truth. The false solution crumbled in my hands like damp paper. The crossword offered me another rebuke. A clue from the same grid. Mistaken path, 11 letters. I filled it in slowly. It stared back at me, smug, inevitable. That was what I had embraced. misdirection, willingly, hungrily, a red herring of my own making, the will, the consort, the quarrels, the photograph, they had all pointed toward Fenton, but only because I had wanted them to. I had mistaken the shadows for the source of the light. Aldous had known this, I thought. Not this time. His phrase had been less confession than warning, one I had ignored, not this time, and yet I had repeated it. I sat long into the night, the whiskey glass empty, the crossword abandoned. The rain outside was steady, unyielding, whispering against the window like a litany. I thought of Aldous, of silence heavier than truth, of music concealing words, of codes written in rests. I thought of Fenton, his smile too knowing, his innocence too easily claimed. And I thought of Howard, his eagerness too sharp, his certainty too fragile. Every clue contradicted another, every answer unravelled. I had solved nothing. Worse, I had believed I had solved something. There is no humiliation like the humiliation of a false solution. It is not the mistake itself, but the moment of recognizing that one's mind, so proud of its deduction, has been deceived not by others, but by itself. I poured another glass, though the hour was late, and spoke aloud to the silence of my rooms. Not this time. The words fell flat, swallowed by shadows. I knew then that the case was not nearing its end, but only its darker turn. False solutions are not conclusions, they are preludes, and this one, heavy as stone, had only just begun to weigh upon me. The room they gave me was one of the older lecture halls, high-ceilinged, wood darkened by centuries of smoke and polish. It smelled of chalk and damp, as if knowledge itself had grown mould. The evening rain tapped faintly at the windows, a rhythm that accompanied the slow assembling of the company. I had asked for them all, the master, the dons, the porter, Howard, and of course, Fenton. They arrived with reluctance, each carrying silence as though it were a cloak. No one spoke at first. They seated themselves in uneven rows, faces dimly lit by the lamps that threw long shadows across the panelled walls. I remained standing, less by choice than by necessity. The case had grown too heavy to sit with. I began without flourishing. Aldous was dead, I said, and we did not yet know whether by design or by despair. But what we knew, or thought we knew, had grown tangled with misdirection. Their eyes lowered, their hands tightened on their knees. Oxford trains its scholars in the art of avoiding gaze. Only Howard looked directly at me, too eager, too frightened. I placed the photograph from the archive on the table. It lay there like a witness, silent but insistent. They glanced at it, then away. Aldous bent over his notebook, Fenton's gaze toward the lens, the torn flyer above the choir stalls. I asked them what it showed. No one answered. Silence, heavier than truth. Fenton finally spoke with a half-smile. It showed a rehearsal, nothing more. His voice is calm, his words precise. But the smile lingered too long, and I knew then that even in denial he offered confession. The photograph revealed not what happened, but what absence demanded we notice. Howard shifted, his foot tapping against the floor. He whispered that Aldous had feared Fenton. The words fell into the hall like a stone into water, spreading ripples of discomfort. The master reprimanded him with a glance, but the damage was done. Fear is never spoken of in Oxford without consequence. I looked at Howard closely. His eagerness betrayed him. Truth, I thought, was not in the accusation, but in the way he sought its shelter. I asked him again about the numbers he had found in Aldous's papers. 14, 19, 25. He recited them as if memorized. I told him they matched crossword clues whose answers spelled note choir shadow end. His eyes widened. He claimed ignorance. Perhaps he spoke the truth, perhaps not. The porter, who had remained silent until then, cleared his throat. He remembered Aldous passing through the lodge late more than once, his satchel heavier than usual. He had asked no questions, for porters do not question scholars. But he also remembered a second figure slipping by, hood drawn, face obscured. He could not name him, though his eyes flicked once, briefly, toward Howard. Silence again, filled with suspicion. I thought of the ledger, the name crossed through violently, leaving only the time 527. Mistakes are never only mistakes. I placed the satchel's contents next on the table. Blurred music, notes dissolving into stains, margins carrying the scrawled phrase, not this time. I asked them what it meant. No answer. They stared at the pages as if the ink itself accused them. The choirmaster muttered finally that Aldous had been obsessed with hidden codes, convinced music carried truths unspoken by words. He called it folly, but his voice lacked conviction. Folly is Oxford's name for anything dangerous to reputation. The rain grew louder against the windows. In the pause I recalled the crossword from the night before Mistaken Path, 11 letters. I had written misdirection. I told them that was what we had followed. The will, the bequest, the quarrel between Fenton and Aldous, all too visible, all too convenient. A red herring concealing something darker. They shifted uneasily. The word red herring has weight, even among scholars accustomed to metaphor. I turned once more to Fenton. He met my gaze without flinching. He asked, almost kindly, if I truly believed he had killed Aldous. His question unsettled me, for it was not defensive but almost weary. I told him belief was not enough. Belief was my mistake before. He nodded, as if granting me the point. Then he said softly that Aldous had destroyed himself long before the cloister, and that none of us could claim ignorance. The words hung in the air, heavier than accusation, heavier even than truth. The dons avoided his eyes. Howard shook his head, muttering denial. The porter looked at the floor, and I stood there, uncertain whether confession had just been spoken or merely evaded. The meeting dissolved slowly like smoke thinning in air. No revelations, no denouement, only fragments, contradictions, silences. They left in ones and twos, their gowns whispering against the stone. Fenton last, his thin smile intact. Howard lingered, seeking reassurance I could not give. The porter closed the door with a finality that echoed too loudly. I remained alone in the hall, the photograph and the scores before me, the rain persistent against the glass. Later, back in my room, I returned again to the crossword. One final clue awaited ending that is not an end. 7 letters. I thought long, then wrote an epilogue. It fitted. An ending that lingers, that does not resolve but refuses silence. That night, whiskey in hand, I understood that Aldous's death would not be solved cleanly, not tied with ribbon. Oxford does not permit such clarity. It thrives on ambiguity, on silences heavier than truth, on contradictions preserved like photographs. The false solution had been stripped away, but what remained was not certain. It was only the quiet knowledge that absence endures longer than presence, and that perhaps was Aldous's final bequest. I closed the crossword, placed the photograph in the drawer, and let the rain continue its practice against the window. Silence returned, not broken, not explained, only heavier. The bells tolled just past midnight, their sound dragging through the wet air like iron on stone. Oxford's bells never strike cleanly. They linger, reverberating, as though each note is unwilling to let go. I listened from my window, whiskey glass in hand, the rain tracing crooked paths down the pane. It was the last toll of a case that had refused to resolve itself, though my mind continued its restless turning. Aldous remained as he had been when first I found him, head bowed, unfinished word before him, silence pressed like lead around his body. Death offers finality. Investigation rarely does. I thought of the final gathering, the dons seated in their common room like jurors who refused to deliberate. Fenton with his guarded smile, Howard with his trembling eagerness, the master with his polished denials, the porter carrying years of knowledge unspoken. They had all left me with fragments, each fragment incomplete, each silence heavier than speech. Oxford does not yield truth, I reminded myself. It preserves ambiguity. Its cloisters are designed for echoes, not answers. Still, I could not shake the sense that somewhere between music and manuscripts, between letters and crosswords, Aldous had left a message. Perhaps for me, perhaps for no one. I spread the papers once more across the desk. The blurred scores from the river, the anonymous letter from the lodge, the photograph from the archive. They formed no coherent order, only the suggestion of one. I touched the words, not this time in the margin, the ink blurred but legible. A warning, a refusal, a resignation. It whispered differently with each reading. Then the other phrase, silence is heavier than the truth. That one had burrowed into me, deeper than I cared to admit. Aldous had written someone had written it for him, but it had become mine as well. Silence heavier than truth. I lifted the glass, swallowed the last of the whiskey, and let the words rest on my tongue like bitterness. I reached for the crossword. One final clue stared back, unsolved for days. Bell that marks an end, 4 letters. I had tried Nell before, but it had not fit the crossings. Tonight, though, it did. I wrote it in, slowly, deliberately, underlining with care. Nell, the last toll. The crossword grid is complete, the case incomplete. It was fitting in its way. Completion is a trick of grids and numbers, not of life. Still I felt the faint satisfaction of order, even if it was only on paper. Outside the bells fell silent, leaving only rain. I thought of Aldis's notebook, the word circled twice viator, traveller. Perhaps that had been his true confession, his acknowledgement of departure. He had left long before he died, withdrawing from his rooms, from his colleagues, from the ordinary rhythm of scholarship. The satchel in the river, the altered will, the coded notes, each an attempt to leave behind what could not be spoken aloud. Did he choose silence, or was silence chosen for him? I could not know, and perhaps I was not meant to. Howard's face lingered with me, too eager, too frightened. I wondered what weight of fear he carried, whether his loyalty to Aldous had been genuine or self-preserving. He had offered me clues, but each one trembled under scrutiny. The numbers, the slip of paper, the whispered certainty that Fenton was near the river. Were these truths or the inventions of a boy desperate to be noticed? I could not decide. The porter's eyes had flicked toward him once, betraying suspicion. That was enough to gnaw at me. Yet suspicion is not true, and in Oxford suspicion is as common as rain. Fenton, too, haunted me. His smile, thin as a blade, offered nothing and everything. Had he envied Aldous, resented him, protected him? His words in the gathering Aldous destroyed himself long before the cloister rang with a kind of weary knowledge. But was it insight or alibi? Did he speak as a man confessing or as one deflecting? I would never know. I feared he knew I would never know, and that was why he smiled. There are few cruelties greater than giving a detective no more than ambiguity. The rain eased, leaving the city wrapped in damp quiet. I opened the window. The air smelled of stone, moss, and extinguished candles. Somewhere a clock struck the quarter hour, softer than the bells, but no less insistent. I imagined Aldous walking the quadrangle at dawn, satchel heavy, music scores tucked inside, shadows following close. He had lived in absence, prepared for silence, and left behind puzzles that mocked my need for resolution. Perhaps he had known no one would solve them. Perhaps that was the point. Not this time, he had written. Perhaps it was addressed to me. I sat back, staring at the crossword grid, now complete. Each word in place, each contradiction resolved within its small world. A comfort, yes, but false. Life did not yield grids. It yielded photographs with torn corners, wills written as misdirection, satchels planted in reeds. Life yielded silence, and silence, as Aldous had known, was heavier than truth. I closed the paper, finished the whiskey, and let the darkness of the room reclaim me. The bells had tolled their last for the night. The investigation, like the rain, would seep on without me, into stone, into shadow, into memory. And so it ended, not with a confession, not with revelation, but with silence. The last toll. The knell that confirms nothing, denies nothing, and leaves everything unresolved.